In April 1986, the city of Pripyat froze in time. Overnight, nearly 50,000 people vanished, leaving behind a ghost city wrapped in silence, decay, and deadly radiation. For decades, the world believed Pripyat was completely empty. But off the official maps, in the pitch-black corridors of rotting Soviet apartment blocks and forgotten subterranean military bunkers, something else remained. Tonight on Nightfall Archives, we uncover 3 disturbing encounters from deep inside the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. Turn off your lights, lock your doors, and whatever you do, never ignore the clicking of the Geiger counter. In the early days of April 1986, the city of Pripyat was considered the crown jewel of the Soviet nuclear industry. Nestled deep within the quiet pine forests of northern Ukraine, it was a modern, thriving city built specifically for the scientists, engineers, and workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Young families walked along paved avenues, children played in pristine parks, and life seemed peaceful. But beneath this atomic paradise, an inexplicable shadow was beginning to fall across the city. It started with a wave of identical nightmares. Beginning around the second week of April, doctors at Pripyat City Hospital noted a sudden surge in residents, reporting acute sleep paralysis and terrifying night terrors. Senior plant operators, men trained to be rational under pressure, began waking up in cold sweats at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning. They spoke of a suffocating sensation, as if an immense unseen weight were pressing on their chests. More disturbingly, many reported the exact same detail. Looking toward their bedroom windows and seeing a massive dark silhouette outlined against the moonlight. A shadowy form with no face, only 2 piercing crimson eyes that burned like dying coals. By mid-April, the phenomenon escalated to physical encounters in the open air. On April 17th, a shift team leaving the power plant late at night reported a sighting near the massive cooling towers. As they walked toward the bus stop, the temperature around them plummeted instantly, freezing their breath. Looking up into the misty darkness above the reactor complex, they saw a creature perched atop the concrete structure. It was humanoid in shape, easily 10 feet tall, but possessed giant leathery wings spanning nearly 20 feet. It sat entirely motionless, staring down at the reactor with those same glowing red eyes. When one worker pointed a flashlight at it, the creature unleashed an ear-splitting metallic shriek before launching itself into the night sky. Curiously, its wings made absolutely no sound as it cut through the air. Panic spread quietly through the ranks of the plant's personnel. Soviet authorities, desperate to prevent disruption to work schedules, strictly forbade anyone from speaking about the sightings. They dismissed the reports as collective hysteria caused by long shifts. But the creature, which locals began whispering about as the Blackbird of Chernobyl, refused to fade away. Residential phone lines across Pripyat began to malfunction erratically. Families were awoken at midnight by landline phones ringing continuously. When they picked up the receiver, there was no voice, only violent static, high-pitched screeching, and a rhythmic, unnatural clicking sound that chilled them to the bone. To those who heard it, the rhythm was hauntingly familiar, though they couldn't place it at the time. Only later would they realize it sounded identical to the frantic clicking of a Geiger counter detecting lethal radiation. On the evening of April 24th, just 48 hours before the catastrophe, a crew of maintenance workers was assigned to inspect the roof near reactor number 4. As they stepped out onto the high roof, an overwhelming feeling of nausea and profound dread swept over the entire team. Standing on the edge of the chimney stack was the Blackbird. It was staring directly down into the heart of the reactor building, its red eyes glowing with terrifying intensity. The workers stood, paralyzed with fear, until the entity spread its vast wings and dove straight down toward the reactor roof, dissolving into the darkness. Then came the night of April 26th, 1:23 a.m. During a safety test, reactor number 4 suffered a catastrophic power surge, leading to a series of massive thermal explosions that tore through the building, ripping off the concrete upper shield and exposing the molten core. As a column of radioactive fire and a brilliant beam of blue ionized air shot into the night sky, firefighters rushed to the scene. Multiple surviving firefighters and operators later recounted an identical detail from those chaotic first minutes. As they fought the raging fires on the crumbling roof, they looked up into the towering column of radioactive smoke. Hovering motionlessly inside the toxic plume, completely unharmed by the heat or the radiation, was the colossal black creature. It was circling slowly above the exposed core, bathed in the blue light of the nuclear reaction. It paused, turned its head toward the dying workers below, and let out a final, deafening shriek before vanishing into the night sky forever. To this day, paranormal researchers debate what the Blackbird truly was. Was it a harbinger of doom drawn to impending tragedy? Or was it something far more sinister, an entity that did not merely predict the disaster, but actively fed upon the terror and energy released on that fateful night? To extreme urban explorers, the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone is the ultimate forbidden frontier. Despite military security and radiation, illegal trespassers known as stalkers regularly cross the perimeter to explore the decaying ghost city of Pripyat. In August 2022, an experienced Ukrainian guide named Taras and an American travel vlogger named Ethan undertook an illegal trek deep into the zone. Their goal was simple: reach the abandoned city center and spend the night inside one of Pripyat's iconic 9-story Soviet apartment complexes. By midnight on their second day, the duo slipped into Micro-District 4. A suffocating dark mist blanketed the abandoned avenues, and rain slicked the cracked asphalt. To avoid military patrols and wild wolf packs, Taras led Ethan into the entrance of Building Number 4, a sprawling residential block built in the late 1970s. Navigating with dim red headlamps, they climbed the crumbling staircase to the 5th floor. Taras chose an interior apartment with intact walls. It was a frozen capsule of Soviet history. A rusted bed frame, yellowed wallpaper, and decaying books on the damp floor. They laid down their sleeping bags, checked their Geiger counters, and prepared to rest. At 2:15 a.m., Ethan woke up to a sudden drop in temperature. His breath formed white clouds in the freezing air. His Geiger counter, resting on a dusty table, clicked with an erratic rhythm. Ethan reached to wake Taras, but Taras was already sitting upright, finger pressed to his lips in a silent command for quiet. Above them, on the 9th floor, something was moving. It started with a sound that made Ethan's blood run cold. Heavy, deliberate boots stepping onto shattered glass and concrete dust. Thud, crunch, thud, crunch. It was not an animal. It was a bipedal figure walking with calm, methodical purpose. Then came a harsh, metallic screech. Something heavy and rusted, like an iron girder, was being dragged across the floor above. Taras whispered, his voice trembling. The 9th floor stairs collapsed 10 years ago. Nobody can be up there. For 10 agonizing minutes, they listened as the steps paced back and forth, directly above them. Driven by shock and morbid curiosity, Ethan grabbed his high-lumen tactical flashlight. He had to know what was sharing this dead building with them. Creeping into the pitch-black hallway, they found a section where iron pipes formed an improvised ladder over collapsed steps. They pulled themselves up floor by floor, the air growing progressively colder and more metallic. Reaching the 9th floor, the frigid air made their eyes water. The narrow corridor stretched into darkness. Ethan raised his flashlight and clicked the power button. A blinding beam of light cut through the dust motes. At the far end of the corridor stood a figure. It was impossibly tall, easily 7.5 feet, with emaciated limbs, wearing the shredded remnants of a dark Soviet coat covered in decades of grime. Its head was tilted at a sickening angle. But what paralyzed Ethan was its face. It wore a severely decayed Soviet rubber gas mask fused directly into its pale skin. The glass lenses were shattered, and from behind them, two pale milky spheres glowed, reflecting the flashlight beam. In its right hand, it held a rusted steel girder. The moment the light struck the entity, the silence was shattered by Ethan's Geiger counter screaming in a solid, continuous tone. Slowly, the creature straightened its spine with a series of loud, wet cracks. It turned, raised its free hand with long, blackened fingers, and pointed directly at Ethan. Then, it let out a high-pitched mechanical screech combined with an agonizing animal howl. "Run!" Terrace screamed, shoving Ethan toward the stairwell. They practically fell down the dark flights of stairs as heavy impacts thundered behind them. Whatever was up there was sprinting, its long limbs slamming against concrete walls. The sound of dragging metal echoed down like a collapsing building. Ethan and Terrace burst out into the pouring rain, running blindly through the overgrown courtyard. They didn't stop until they reached the open central town square, lungs burning, when Ethan gathered the courage to look back toward the distant silhouette of building number 4. The fog had parted slightly. High up on the crumbling balcony of the 9th floor, the towering dark figure stood, staring down at them through the night. Ethan left the exclusion zone before dawn. He never returned to Chernobyl, but he still hears that metallic screeching in his nightmares, a reminder that in Pripyat, some apartments are still occupied. Deep in the dense pine forests of the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, 4 miles from the nuclear power plant, stands one of the Soviet Union's most terrifying secret installations, the Duga Radar Array. Known during the Cold War as the Russian woodpecker, due to the sharp tapping radio signal it broadcast across the globe, this colossal metal structure spans over 500 feet high and a quarter-mile long, while tourists often gaze at its massive steel grid. Few know about the sprawling subterranean command complex buried deep beneath the forest floor, a forgotten labyrinth of concrete corridors, blast doors, and classified military laboratories. In October 2021, Mark, an American audio engineer specializing in Cold War military frequency archives, obtained illegal access to the secret facility known as Chernobyl 2. Accompanied by his local guide, Victor, Mark aimed to enter the flooded sublevels of the main Duga control bunker. Mark carried specialized acoustic equipment and high-frequency radio receivers, obsessed with recording the strange electromagnetic interference still detected around the radar array, decades after its abandonment. Descending through an overgrown emergency escape hatch near the radar's base, Mark and Victor stepped into total darkness. The air was thick, damp, and tasted heavily of iron and rot. Their flashlights illuminated walls covered in flaking green paint, decaying Soviet propaganda posters, and long rows of gutted computer server racks. As they pushed deeper into sub-level 3 nearly 40 feet underground, the ambient temperature dropped precipitously. They reached the primary communications vault, a cavernous room filled with massive steel radio transmitters and rusted control consoles. Mark set up his audio recorder and extended a directional parabolic microphone into the dark corridor. Putting on his studio headphones, he flipped the power switch. At first, there was only the expected hiss of white noise and the faint dripping of water. But as he fine-tuned the frequency band, a sound emerged that made him freeze. Through the static, a rhythmic, mechanical tapping sound pulsed softly into his ears. Tap, tap, tap. It was the exact 10 Hz frequency repetition rate of the original Russian woodpecker signal, which had ceased broadcasting in 1989 when the installation was decommissioned. "Victor, listen to this," Mark whispered, handing over the headphones. Victor listened for a few seconds before his face turned pale. "That's impossible," Victor muttered. The entire complex was completely disconnected from the power grid 35 years ago. There are no generators here. Driven by a mixture of scientific fascination and growing anxiety, Mark followed the signal's source further down the corridor toward sub-level 4, a deep vault, marked with Soviet radiation danger symbols and heavy steel blast doors. The heavy iron door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, rusted solid, leaving a narrow 2-foot gap leading into pitch darkness. As Mark raised his flashlight to shine it through the gap, his Geiger counter unexpectedly began to click. The radiation levels, which had been completely normal throughout the upper levels, were suddenly rising rapidly. Click, 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 click. Mark peered through the narrow opening in the blast door. The beam of light cut through a thick, floating mist inside the vault, illuminating a massive array of vacuum tube computer racks. But in the center of the room, sitting at a glowing control desk, was a figure. It wore a faded, high-ranking Soviet officer's uniform, complete with heavy wool coat and peaked cap. But the officer was not human. Its body was unnaturally skeletal, draped in dusty fabric, and its hands resting on the control switches were long, withered, and bone-dry. Most chilling of all, the ancient green cathode ray monitors on the console were flickering with soft, pulsating green light, casting an eerie glow across the officer's sunken, featureless face. Suddenly, the tapping sound stopped in Mark's headphones. The skeletal officer slowly turned its head 90 degrees toward the blast door. It had no eyes, only empty black sockets filled with swirling blue static light, identical to the radiation glow of a damaged reactor core. A deafening blast of metallic feedback exploded through Mark's headphones, knocking him backward onto the wet concrete. Simultaneously, the heavy steel blast door began to groan and slide open on its rusted tracks with immense force, as if pulled by an invisible, powerful force from within the vault. "Out! Get out now!" Victor screamed, grabbing Mark by his jacket and dragging him back toward the stairs. They sprinted through the underground maze as the entire bunker shook with a low, vibrating hum. The sound of massive high-voltage relays snapping shut echoed behind them in the darkness, accompanied by the terrifying sound of heavy boots marching in unison down the flooded corridors. Mark and Victor scrambled out of the emergency hatch into the cool autumn air, slamming the metal hatch cover shut behind them. They collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for breath as the massive Duga Radar array above them vibrated faintly against the overcast sky. Mark never published the audio recordings from that night, but whenever he listens to radio static late at night, he can still hear the rhythmic tapping of the woodpecker, an endless signal broadcasting from a bunker that should be dead, controlled by something that refuses to rest. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone remains a haunting testament to human ambition and sudden catastrophe. But as these encounters suggest, the real danger may not just be the invisible radiation lingering in the soil. It is what has made those quiet, decaying ruins its home. Whether it's the shadow of the Blackbird, the unnatural presence haunting the halls of Building Number 4, or the strange signals radiating from beneath Duga, the zone holds secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. If you enjoyed this episode of Nightfall Archives, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more disturbing stories. Have you ever experienced something inexplicable in an abandoned place? Share your story in the comments below. Until next time, stay out of the dark